Hey, mass perception is gone. Do me a favor and sing it out loud. Wherever I go, I'm in a crowd. Whoa, sleepless days, wandering haze. Staring at the lines on the road ahead.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this dialogue on race featuring youth voices. My name is Abby Ferber, and I'm the director of the Matrix Center for the Advancement of Social Equity and Inclusion at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And we are sponsoring this event along with Dazzle Presents, and just so happy to be there. And thank you to everyone watching us for joining us. And we hope you'll participate with comments and questions when they come up. I'm going to read a few notes because if not, I have a tendency to just talk and talk. I don't want to take up too much of the time since you're not here to hear me. So I wanted to let you know first that the Matrix Center, our mission is to bridge the university and the academic community with a much wider public. And so this really fits with our goals. And we hope to serve our community by providing and highlighting really diverse views, diverse audiences, and bringing people into conversation, into civil dialogue, which is often, over the past few years been lacking. And so I do want to emphasize that the views presented here today and at all of our discussions do not represent the views of the University of Colorado and University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, because our goal is to share many different perspectives. I'm confident that our dialogue today will be painful, but it's also urgently necessary and very much overdue. My work has always focused on privilege for over 20 years now, and I never, ever thought I would hear the mainstream media utter the words white privilege. And so I think, to me, what that means is it's opening up a window for this kind of honest dialogue, and that it's really important for us to take advantage of that right now and to contribute to the discussion and to let your voices be heard. I do want to say for other white folks like myself and others that are, at any point in your journey, that at times these dialogues and all of the dialogues going on around our nation are going to be uncomfortable. But that's a good thing. That means you're learning. That's what I always tell my students, right? It means you're learning something new, challenging yourself. And so I encourage everyone out there to do the same. And also, I want to mention that we are all on a lifelong journey to understand our systems of oppression and privilege. And we're all going to make mistakes along the way. No matter how long I deal with these issues in the classroom and in the public, I still make mistakes. And I appreciate when people highlight them and give me the gift of letting me know that I said something that might have been offensive for someone or might have been hurtful. And so don't worry about making mistakes. That's how we learn. What matters is that you continue the work and move forward. Finally, before we start, I think it's really important for me to recognize and share my tremendous gratitude to all of our panelists that you'll be meeting in a moment, to Linda Smith, the program manager for the Matrix Center, and she's been incredible in helping to organize these events and helping to organize all of the events that the Matrix Center offers and sponsors. And you may not know this, but the Matrix Center, in collaboration with the White Privilege Conference, started and continues to offer the only international journal focused on privilege. And it's called Understanding and Dismantling Privilege. And it's wonderful to see more people looking at the journal. It's online, open access. The many issues there are archived, and you can go back and read all of them. And it's a wonderful way to continue to educate yourself and learn. I also want to thank all of the professionals behind the scenes who are making this possible. Everyone is volunteering their time. I want to thank Dwight, Mike, Donald, the owner of Dazzle, who's generously provided this space for us to offer this long series of dialogues. I want to thank Corey, Maribel, and I'm sure there's others that I'm missing, but I just want to say thank you. And to everyone, you're literally risking your lives being here today. And so I want to acknowledge that and let you know how much I appreciate you. All right, I think I have said enough at this point, and I really want to turn things over to our panelists. And I have a few questions that I want to start with, and hopefully all of you out there on YouTube and Facebook and the Dazzle Presents website will start posting questions and comments as well. So first, I'd like to ask you all to just begin by introducing yourself, sharing your pronouns, and tell us a bit about you, a little bit about your background, your schooling, your work, what your commitments are right now. Thank you. You want to begin?
Sure. My name is Jasmine Hammond. I currently live in Colorado Springs. I co-host a philosophy group for young professionals and students with Trey Smith here. My education, I would have to say, I did go to CU, but the biggest thing in my education was living and working abroad, which probably taught me the most about discrimination, and especially in the workforce across the world, discrimination in religion, traveling, things like that. That was my biggest form of education by far. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Trey?
Yeah, I'm Trey. I go by he, him. I went to UCCS, took a senior victory lap, so it was 5 years instead of 4. This is part of the BSU, the Black Student Union, while I was there.
Can you say what that means?
The Black Student Union?
Yeah. in the BSU.
I guess the short version would be like if there's kind of a separate, I don't know if I use the word coalition, but a separate group of Black students that we form different types of things. Sometimes we work with the African Association and we work with them, or we would get together and say, what can we put on for Black students? Because a lot of things will cater specifically towards Caucasian heteronormativities, that kind of thing. So we would just put on stuff like that. Groups for us to get together and feel community, for lack of better words. So yeah, that was my schooling at UCCS. We grew up in the Springs. I mean, most of my understanding of oppression comes from just living. So I would say that's probably the majority of where everything comes from for me.
Thank you.
I'm Xander. I typically use they, them pronouns. I'm a student at UCCS. I'm really active in the student life community. I'm the president of the Trans Student Union. I do a lot of stuff with Spectrum, which is like the LGBT group on campus. I try to do a lot with like the Women's Student Association. I'm an LAS Peak ambassador. So I'm like a little bit all over the place. I'm going to school to be a journalist, specifically for advocacy. I want to like help do more surrounding like water rights and other marginalized bodies and community.
Thank you.
I'm Josh. Josh Roggie is my name, and I go by he, him. So my education I completed online through Southern New Hampshire University a couple years ago in creative writing. I'm actually in the workforce at this point in telecommunications, and my long-term objective is to be a full-time writer. I released a book earlier this year, not super relevant to today's topic. It's called Shame, an Unconventional Memoir, but it's I'm realizing I wish I would have talked more about race in that, and maybe that will be in my future writings more. So, and I think I'm the old man on this panel. So thanks for considering me a young person still.
Yeah, I told them all before that they're all younger than me.
Yeah.
So I consider them youth.
Thanks.
Shay?
So, my name is Shayana Dabney, but everybody calls me Shay. I am going into my senior year at CSU Pueblo.
Do you want to say what CC is?
I'm sorry?
Name the school for people out
Colorado
there.
State University Pueblo. I apologize.
Thank you.
I double major in political science and history. I am currently the president of the Black Student Union. I am the vice president of the Pueblo Young Democrats, and I am the president of my chapter of my sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. In the community lately, I've been, I would say, dabbling in activism. It really began, I was going to say, I don't know if that would be appropriate to get into right now or later.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I guess it first began when Devon Bailey was shot. I believe it was August of last year. That was the first protest that I had helped organize and participated in. And then here again with the murder of George Floyd, I helped organize a couple of events in the Springs. I've been pretty active on the scene. I worked with some of the policy that went behind the scenes to city council recently. So, yeah, I'm just one person trying to do my part, pretty much.
Thank you. Great.
I have a comment. If everybody can take their mask off when they're talking, please.
Thank you.
It's easier to understand this then.
Okay, we've had a request from the online audience asking us to take off our masks while we're speaking. And I'll say, if you're comfortable doing that, if not, maybe move a little closer to the microphone. Well, and you probably didn't understand that since I had my mask on. So I've said, if everyone feels comfortable doing that, please do. Thank you all. I did not mention that I go by the pronouns she, her, and hers. And I want to ask you all to go a little deeper in sharing with us about your upbringing, your education about race and racism, oppression, privilege. Did your family talk about it? Did your parents ever talk about this? You know, what were your experiences? How did you first come to start talking and understanding the systematic racism that's embedded in our nation? Do you want to, or anyone want to start? We don't always have to go in order.
I'll kick it off. I'll go ahead.
Thank you.
So I went to Roosevelt Edison Charter School in Colorado Springs. It is a charter school, as the name implies, and a lot of my cohorts were white. And that wasn't something, I was gonna say, there was plenty of Hispanics in the school too, but my point in that being is it wasn't something that was obvious to me. It wasn't something that was apparent to me. It wasn't until maybe, I would say 3rd or 4th grade when we started in the charter school, they had certain benchmarks that we had to reach for reading and math and things like that. So when we started to be tested in our reading levels, I noticed that it's just, I seem to have been receiving more attention than the other students, and I just noticed that I got a lot more care from the other two students, and it just didn't really click to me as to why until I was in middle school, and I was in a predominantly Hispanic environment at that time. It was Jack Swagger in District 11. It was mostly Hispanic at that time, I would like to say. I was young, so I can't really say, but my interactions with the other students became different. So they started to make comments about my hair that I hadn't been previously unaware of, and comments about my complexion that I had never been exposed to. And I wouldn't even say upset, but just confused. And I came home and I spoke to my parents about it. And that I would say would be the first conversation I ever had with my parents about race. Was then I was made aware for the first time that I was black, and that being black had implications, and that my behavior was more closely monitored because of the fact that I was black. If I was going to be successful, I had to do more than the other kids around me, and this was all instilled in me from a very young age. So race has always been, in a really kind of weird way, the forefront of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And if anyone wants to jump in and also respond to Shay's comments or each other at any point, go ahead.
I can go next.
Thank you.
So mine was almost the exact opposite experience. I grew up in upstate New York. I was just saying very upstate, almost Canada, New York. And there were almost no people of color of any race or ethnicity. It was almost exclusively white until I moved to Colorado Springs I think I was about 15. And I know Colorado Springs is not necessarily the most ethnically diverse city either, but compared to my childhood, it actually was quite a bit different for me. So I definitely come from a place more of, I guess, ignorance or unawareness through my childhood. It's stereotypical, but the exposure that I had was really just in sports. I love football and basketball, so even though I didn't have many personal interactions with people of color, I really I guess I had like heroes or people I looked up to, like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and Emmitt Smith. And I think that even though it's maybe a little like surface level, it did help me to at least understand like the humanity of people who are different from me. And then moving to Colorado Springs, I still, went to a middle-class private school, so there were not many people of color there either. That's actually where I met Trey. We didn't go to high school together, but we went to the same school, so we've known each other for several years now. And I think that's really probably, if there's a starting point to my like education on this, is knowing somebody like Trey who I guess had patience with me as I've been on my own journey and learning things. So it's still definitely a process for me, and I'm thankful to be here and look forward to hearing what everybody else has to say.
So, kind of similar story. Like, I'm white, so I grew up with the privilege of ignorance. I also grew up in Alaska, where if you know anything about Alaska, it's mostly white people. And the racism in Alaska tends to be a lot more directed at natives, and like being drunk all the time and such. So after I moved halfway through high school, I moved to Virginia, and I didn't understand the schools. Like, I didn't understand why everybody hated one school, and the school I went to was considered like okay, and the school you wanted to go to was like this. I didn't understand why these were things, and it took a while for me to realize it was a lot to do with race. The school that nobody wanted to go to was like primarily black students, and they weren't getting a lot of funding. And the school I went to had a lot of like black and Latino students, and we got decent funding, and it was all right. And the school you wanted to go to was predominantly white. So I'm still like pretty young and like learning the ropes of like what I understand racism to be for me personally, and how I see and experience it out in the world. But I forgot where I was going with that, I'm sorry. But it's been a journey, and I'm still relatively new, and I appreciate like everybody speaking here today.
Thank you.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, kind of growing up. And today, I guess I know them as microaggressions would be the best word. Sometimes they weren't so micro, sometimes they were pretty straightforward, but a lot of things about, kind of like Shay was saying, about comments about my hair. I grew a fro for a little bit in like middle school and high school, and so there was, people wanting to touch my hair, putting stuff in my hair without even like really being considerate of me as an individual. When I wanted to get cornrows, being asked if it was gang related, even though it's about the culture. I was in high school when Obama was being elected, so all sorts of stuff about intelligence insulting to me about you'd only vote for him because he's black, and I guess you could call those microaggressions to that degree. And my parents, I too many conversations to go over, too many interactions with other students to go over. But like he was saying, I went to predominantly white school, which was odd because during the day I spent time with predominantly white students, and then on weekends at home I'm going to mostly black churches, spending time with mostly black folk, families from Oklahoma, so it's like me, Southern black folk as well. And so I felt, I don't know, there was like a stranger of two different worlds at times, where I felt like my culture wasn't accepted in my daily life, but I felt like this was pretty normal for me. So I started to, I guess, kind of, for lack of better words, try to fit in more, because it was easier than having to explain what words I was saying or what music I listened to or what I ate consistently. And conversations with my parents, my father is very educated in terms of black history, mom the same way. But I sit down and watch documentaries and hear firsthand tales from them, because they integrated schools. They were part of military integration in several different ways. The stuff that they went through, driving people around during the bus boycotts in the 60s and stuff like that, it's firsthand knowledge, hearing things from them, and then telling me how I need to carry myself as a black man. And the same thing as Shay was saying, like, I have to work twice as hard to get even the same place. And as I got older, that became rang true in the workplace where I had to would work twice as hard and literally get the same pay as someone else who had half the experience that I did. So that's, I guess, the abridged version of it, as close as I can get.
Thank you.
And I should have added that I didn't have any racial conversations with my parents. I think they probably didn't think it was needed or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I kind of had a similar experience growing up. My parents I love them very much, but they're they're probably the most conservative yuppies you'll meet, which they really enjoy art and culture from different areas of the world. And I appreciate that, and I grew up with that, but there was never an effort to have a discussion about race. There was never an effort to honor where the art came from, but rather pick and choose what parts were acceptable and what weren't. My first idea of systemic racism is my grandparents and my parents for a time of their lives were Mormon, and when I was young, I learned about how, oh, well, white men can hold the priesthood, but black men can't, and that's the word from God. And then I believe it was in the 90s, like mid-90s, the prophet of the Mormon church was like, oh, wait, never mind. I had a revelation from God, and now it's okay that black people can hold the priesthood. So that was my first idea of really how normal it is in every facet of American life, at least. So yeah, that was my first introduction into it.
Thank you. Just to follow up on some of your comments, I'm wondering if other people have also had experiences like Jazzy, where you've been dealing with people who consider themselves to be very liberal white people, and not just whites, but what do you think about their involvement or lack of involvement or understanding in terms of what's going on in the world today, in terms of discussions around the protests, discussions that we're having finally about racism embedded in institutions and our history? Anyone want to share what they think?
Yeah. As Jazzy mentioned, we help run a philosophy group. It's been going on for about seven years now. That meets on Wednesdays, and we, I say we have a pretty solid balance of an influx of like predominantly liberal, but also mostly Caucasian attendees, and we recently had a discussion where I kind of just got tired of I guess kind of glossing over race-related questions, or seeming as if activism wasn't being happened as much, as even though it's a group that prides itself on wanting to speak about intellectual things and take action on intellectual things on a personal level, on a religious level, societal level. And I felt like, shockingly, is one of the few black representatives, if not the only one, that it just wasn't being talked about enough, and that if they just continue to listen to me, they're not going to hear it. So I brought in a couple homies. Mom, Dr. Rose came in to speak with everyone, because I felt like it's very easy for liberal-leaning Caucasian people to feel like because I'm listening, I'm doing enough, or because I have a black friend, I'm doing enough. And I felt like at a certain point, that's just not enough. There needs to be more, and I feel like it's not wrong to ask more of people when a situation calls for it. So yeah, in situations like that, I feel like I'm going to start being more honest and just being like, just hearing me talk is great, and I appreciate you wanting to listen, because historically my voice is not listened to. Mm-hmm. But it has to go beyond that. We have to put into, we have to do actions. And if my life is considered, and the actions that I do over the course of my life isn't going to be helpful, you have to use your privilege to stand up and do something to be helpful. So that's typically the experiences I've had over the course of most of my college and adult life. It's just like, yeah, I just listened, so that's good enough.
Why do you think you commented that now you feel you need to be more honest and say that's not enough?
I think that was feeling more and more frustration with a lack of. Part of it was because I slightly immunocompromised, so I couldn't go out to protests as much as I'd like to, or at all. And I felt like I was kind of like, protests aren't enough, but they're super helpful. There needs to be actual action. And with my interactions with the police, I felt like, I kind of let things happen and just be like, that's the system, I got to let it go. But now understanding more about, police unions and qualified immunity and understanding more about that, feeling like, okay, I can spur these people on into voting for these types of things and for participating more, to learning about more. And so it was frustration from not being able to protest, frustration from feeling like even though people are like trying to hear me, they don't really put into action with what's going on, or making excuses about, well, this is being said, or within our group in and of itself is like, having conversations amongst white people is phenomenal and important if it comes from someone who is an ally, is invited to be an ally, and has a discussion with it. But they mentioned like, oh, we had a discussion about the protest, so we don't really need to have another discussion about it again. And I was like, well, who was there? There was no black representative there. It was just you guys having an echo chamber amongst each other. And so that kind of added on to the frustration of like, all right, that's enough. We need to have discussions and put action to words.
In my experience, it's interesting because you say you weren't at the protest, but you were really able to capture the spirit of the complacency of the white liberal. And it's something that people don't want to talk about, but it's something that is as detrimental to the cause as lost messaging. So from my experience in being at the protests, I have afforded the community the opportunity to grieve and express themselves to the community at several points via, I would just get a simple microphone, let people speak to the crowd, vent their feelings. We've seen a lot of, it's Colorado Springs, it's a predominantly white area, so there's a lot of white people there. And there's a lot of white people coming to the microphone and that are only speaking to their experience. And to me, that is inappropriate because this is not your moment. Like, there is a time and place for everything, and the time is not now. This is a place where we've had enough of having politically correct conversations. We've had enough of sweeping things under the rug, where it's time to let people know what the facts are. I was at an NAACP rally, messaging rally, and I forget her name, but she was a white pastor from the community, and she came and she spoke about how she is still racist, and she has been doing this work for decades, and she still feels that lethargy. She gets tired in doing this work because it's exhausting, it's a long fight, and she talks about how she gets to experience that tiredness. Like, if she decides not to go, then that's fine. But if I decide not to go, then I risk my life. And that's just something that white liberals, it's more than just showing up to the protest. You have to have hard conversations, and you have to look at your own behaviors and really look at what you're really doing.
Mm-hmm. What'd you say, Josh? We didn't hear you.
Oh, I didn't say anything, but I can jump in because I do have something. I like what you all are saying. I think that the white liberal woke culture type thing is probably about where I land, and that's really what I've been, I guess, evaluating in myself over the last few weeks. Is I think that for too long, I'm glad that I got to a point where I could hear voices like Trey's and really did genuinely value that, and I still do. But I've just realized that isn't enough. You're right. It's not moving things forward the way that they need to be moved forward. And I'll admit I still don't know what my role in it exactly is. I think that it is important. I mean, I'm a white male, so we tend to try to want to run everything, right? And I don't want that to happen at all either. I don't want to be in the spotlight. I actually maybe even feel a little uncomfortable being here, but I wanted to participate and, really especially hear what you all have to say. So I guess what I'm just getting at is I'm on board with what you're saying, and I appreciate that feedback for me and my demographic.
Well, I have a question for everybody, if you don't mind.
No, go right ahead.
So a couple weeks ago, I came under fire for basically telling a lot of white people in my life, hey, we need to shut up and just do what we're told to do in this conversation. And I've heard many people who are both black and who are white saying, oh, now's the time for conversation. And I understand that. Part of me, though, thinks, and I wonder what you guys think about this, which is for people like myself, for people like Josh, it's time for us to just shut up and be told what to do and be active. Yes, we can have conversations, but those no longer can be the main way that we confront racism. I don't know if you guys think that's a good path or an incorrect path to take for white people.
I would never ask that, especially if you are a true ally, that you don't voice your opinion because your opinion is valuable. I was going to say, the best person to speak to black experience is a black person, but you can still speak to what you observe. And I think that that's important to remember. Also, in as far as looking for what you need to do, it's institutional change. It is huge that you sit here as a white man and acknowledge the fact that you have privilege, that you as a white liberal, you don't know really what you're doing next. That's huge because this is rampant in social media. This is like the theme of the conversation is that what is the next step? And I think that as white people, you have to realize you guys have the authority in the institutions that matter to make the real change. And it's about changing those institutions is the real next step.
That's helpful, thank you. I think were you going to say something, Trey?
Well, I was actually going to say if Xander wants an opportunity to speak, he hasn't had it in a while, but
Yeah.
I do have something I want to say afterwards, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess I feel like, we've hit a lot of the points in the conversation. Like, I'm honestly just really disappointed in where white people are at right now. Like, it feels like to me you have to actively lack compassion to let the situation be where it is now. And I don't know what people think they're accomplishing just by doing the Twitter thing. And I don't know what they think they're doing because it's not doing anything other than putting out more words in the void of everything. So I really want there to be a systemic change, but I also know it's really daunting because it's not just an issue in police departments. It's an issue with child protective services and education, and it's a problem everywhere, and it just really needs to be addressed now.
What would you prefer to see white people doing instead of tweeting into the void?
Well, I think it depends on the individual a little bit, if all you can do is talk to your racist parents, then that's what you should do. But if you have a position in office, if you're a teacher, if you're in the police department, there are so many other things you can be doing in those positions. I'm not gonna blame a 16-year-old kid for just tweeting and thinking they're making a difference. I'm gonna blame the 25-year-old who can make a difference and isn't.
So I wanted to, go ahead, Trey.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead, because I'm going to change the topic slightly.
I guess to respond to your initial question, Jazzy, would be, I think maybe the language of shut up and do as you're told is very abrasive and slightly off to a certain extent, but I understand where you're coming from. Because I mentioned that to the same group of people. It's just now's the time to shut up and listen. And that doesn't mean for the rest of eternity. It just means that for hundreds of years, there's been a voice of people that haven't been heard. And now's the time to listen. And if we ask you to do something, obviously, effectively, critically think in what it is, but understand that it comes from a black experience, and that if we're telling you this is what we feel might be most helpful, then maybe that's a good way to go. So I wouldn't necessarily say do anything without question, or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, it's this is what I'm telling you would be effective. From my experiences, obviously 1 or 2 or 3 black people don't speak for the whole community, but I think it's on the right track, but maybe the semantics need to be changed a bit.
Okay, sounds good. And just to clarify for all those listening, having conversations is great, But if you're not backing it up with anything, with any active choices or actual voting or things like that, then I don't think that's enough, personally. So.
Well, I was just going to ask to continue this dialogue a little bit further. You've probably seen there are so many articles in the media today and spreading online about how to be a good ally. And some people use the term co-conspirator or other terms. But what do you think about that, about the term ally, and thinking about how allies could support you? What would you want to see in a good ally yourself, personally?
An ally to me, you cannot decide to be an ally. You have to be, it's a relationship. And that relationship is dependent on shared experiences, time spent. So you can't just wake up one day and decide, I'm woke about racism and I'm an ally now and I'm going to go fight for black people. Because what black person has co-signed you? Because this is not your movement to co-opt. This is not your movement to say, I'm here to fight this battle. You can only be invited. So an ally, just ensure that you have true relationships with black people in your life and you understand the real implications, because it's easy to paint the signs and it's easy to take the pictures and it's easy to scream the chants, but it's very hard to do the work and make the institutional change that you're referring to. So before you call yourself an ally, understand what that truly means.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo those same sentiments. It's you know, it's very much not just, today I feel like being helpful, and then I think that's another part of the privilege is you get to decide when to participate in the cause of the movement. It's not necessarily a checklist of like you have to be invited. It's more to do with, is this something you're in for real? Is this something that, and Dr. Rose has mentioned this before, there's people you're cool with and there's people that are ride or dies. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's like ally is someone who's a ride or die regardless of the conversation. They'll ask me questions. I don't have to go out of my way to speak with them about something. They're cognizant of what they're saying and what they're doing. And they don't stand up and speak up and say, like, I'm an ally. If you feel like you need to say that out loud, more often than not, it just means like you're trying to garner attention. Mm-hmm. And so it's your actions speak up for what you're actually doing for being an ally. And I think that's important. I feel like for me, that's something I need to grow as a man with privilege, especially a light-skinned man. Being an ally to women requires me to have difficult conversations, requires me to understand my thought process. And I think that makes it easier for me to understand when people who are trying to be allies to the Black movement and Black Lives Matter movement is coming at it with empathy and understanding, because I hope that someone would do the same thing for me in a situation where I'm not as fully cognizant of the privileges that I have. So.
I think the word ally is also kind of like an intangible thought. Like, it just might be to me. Like, I wouldn't call myself an ally, like maybe like an ally in training. Because like, it doesn't feel like I do enough to give myself that title, like I'm not out there on the streets every single day. I can honestly tell you, like, I have no idea how politics works. Like, for those reasons, I feel like, I can't call myself an ally, but I feel like I come in with, like, the empathy, the love, like seeking the understanding and like relating experiences to my own, like as a queer person, as a disabled person. And that's kind of how I feel about the whole, like, what does it mean to be an ally? Like, it means that, like, you're active, you're paying your dues, like, daily. You're not just paying your dues and calling it good.
So I would love you to expand a little bit more. Both Trey and Xander brought up a really important concept of intersectionality, right? And I believe that all of us have some form of privilege, whether it is white, heterosexual, able-bodied and minded, religious privilege, sexual privilege, cisgender privilege. I've yet to meet someone who doesn't have some form of privilege. And I think that's a way that people can come together and work together if we're all starting from a place of acknowledging the forms of privilege we have. And it's not a oppression Olympics, right? Acknowledging that those forms of privilege the experiences are very different, right? In terms of what we deal with on a daily basis or don't have to deal with on a daily basis. But would anyone else like to comment, or would you like to expand, Trey and Xander, on what intersectionality means to you? And what, people who haven't heard that concept, intersectionality, how would you explain that?
Okay. Do you want it? You can.
That's a good
You can have it.
So,
You're all generous.
intersectionality to me has always been, it's a concept that has been recently introduced to me, as a matter of fact, maybe only a year ago in my education. And it is the concept that you can have multiple experiences and they all overlap and they all contribute to what is your experience. And what I have taken away from intersectionality is indeed that every person has privilege in some asset. And it's not that in saying you have privilege is not to say that you have not suffered. And I think that that's a concept that people run away with a lot, is that when you say you have white privilege, they take that to mean is, oh, I've been benefited in my life, when those are not synonymous and they are not the same. Mm-hmm. And as a light-skinned woman, I share in my knowledge of the fact that I am less susceptible to racism in the medical arena. Like, dark-skinned black women are highly susceptible to medical racism, and that's just something that I don't experience. But as a light-skinned woman, I can use whatever platform I garner to bring attention to that fact. And that is the importance, I think, and the key in intersectionality is acknowledge your platform and using it to create equity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Whenever I'm explaining intersectionality, I usually go back to Kimberly Crenshaw. Like, she's known for coining the term. And the famous case is there were black women who were being fired or couldn't get a job with Ford. And going to court, they couldn't have a case for discrimination because there were women working at the plant and there were black men at the plant, but they weren't black women. So part of the intersection is like you have an intersection of oppressions and you can get hit from either side. And then furthermore, there's not going to be an ambulance to pick you up because you can't tell them what street you're on. You're in an intersection. So when we're talking about intersectionality, there's like a lot that goes into it. And I personally would think, like adapting what the wolves do when they travel in packs to our marches would be like a great thing to do with intersectionality. Like putting our disabled black people in the front of the march, putting the elderly black people in the front of the march so they can set the pace and everybody can march together. I think like that would be a really powerful thing to do in a movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's resistance to that? Or people maybe just don't think about it?
I don't think there's that much resistance as much as I think there's a lot of ignorance. Like a lot of people assume if you're in a wheelchair, you can't go anywhere. But let me tell you, like no cop wants to be caught on video hurting somebody in a wheelchair or with any other assistive device. Like that just looks bad, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I would argue that they don't care at this point anymore. I mean,
yeah, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
But like, I feel like that's just like a different level. Like, what are the cops doing? And it's something that's been moved in like protests before. It just doesn't get used in similar situations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would say I experience the opposite. I would say I see a lot of resistance to the concept of intersectionality. I have had experiences and conversations in which I have tried to explain to a black man his privilege. And it was interesting in how it devolved into me being sexist and there was name calling, but a lot of times people don't want to hear, especially black men, because they are target to so much strife that they do also oppress and they do also have privilege. And it's a hard conversation to have, but it's a necessary one at the same time.
Thank you.
I think it also, for people in my demographic, it just requires humility that doesn't come naturally to us, and because we're in a system that doesn't really require us to be that humble. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but I think that's where that resistance comes from. Is it just is something that needs to be like, I need to make that effort to hear other people and not assume that my worldview and my experience is the norm.
Yeah, I would say, kind of piggybacking off of what you were saying, in white culture, I feel there's such an ingrained part or value in being first. Like, we love the first to go to the moon, the first to climb a mountain, the first to, colonize this one, continent. And to me, I had this realization when I was thinking about Juneteenth, and maybe I've been miseducated about it, but my understanding was Juneteenth celebrates when the last of all the slaves were told that they were no longer slaves. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So, and what's beautiful about that is that everyone's included. We won't celebrate until everyone knows that they're free, not just the first. And that's a huge shift in thinking for a white person to, because maybe Josh, you grew up this way too. There's a lot of pressure to be the first in your family to do this, or, to achieve some sort of high goal. And that type of thinking leaves so many people behind.
It also changes our understanding a little bit too about how we look at, policies, laws, discourse around these events. We learn in school the date of when slavery became illegal. But then to think about, wow, for so many people, they continued to be literally owned and not freed and not told that they could now be free, that they now legally were free. And so to see how at that point that institutionalized racism still continued, it was so deep, and of course still continues today. So I wanted to go back to something, Shay, that you said earlier when talking about what it means to be an ally, and that you see some co-optation of that term and of those behaviors and of the movement in general. So I'm wondering, you all may not watch TV or social media, but I've seen a lot of corporations lately sort of coming out and making a statement of how they support the African American community or stand there in struggle with them. And, some don't say anything more than that. Others announce that they're making what they see as a significant donation to an organization. And I saw an advertisement yesterday for Dove saying that they were going to donate $5 million. And I'm just thinking about that. That's very little, right? If we think about, I don't know, what does the CEO make, right? How much do they make a year in profits? And I don't want to just focus on Dove because I've seen that come from so many companies. And have you witnessed that? What are your thoughts about them, about that behavior? And have you seen, what are the other forms of co-optation that you've been seeing?
I don't remember where I was learning about this, but you have you can split the economy into the races, so you have a white economy and a black economy. Basically what you're saying is when a white person has $1, how long does it stay in a white hand? And the numbers on it are ridiculous for the black community. It's almost a month for a white person, but it's only 6 hours for a black person. So when I see these companies making these statements, I'm just thinking you guys have the economy already. You guys have the money. You guys stole the land. You stole the people. You stole the resources to make all this money. And the only real ethical thing to do is to not have so many white corporations really that invest in black business. So I don't think it's enough to say, like, yeah, we're donating $5 million to this group. I think if they were trying to actually do anything good, they would support the Black community and support the Black economy.
Yeah, and then on top of that, I don't know if you guys heard about this, but apparently Starbucks comes out and they are openly in support of Black Lives Matter and protesting, but they won't allow their employees to wear anything that even hints at Black Lives Matter. And when it comes to the dress code at Starbucks, you still have to wear in a white normative, certain kind of style, depending on, what your hair is like, and you're only allowed to dress a certain way. So even though they say, oh, we still value all lives, when it comes down to the day-to-day business, companies like Starbucks, I don't see them backing that up.
Now they're making merchandise that's specifically Black Lives Matter oriented.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Okay,
good,
let me
good.
just repeat that for people
Yeah.
listening who may not have heard that. Someone in the audience said they've heard that Starbucks has started to change that and are now producing merchandise that says Black Lives Matter and changing how people are allowed to dress in the workplace.
What I understood from what I read.
Yes. Everything we're saying out there, go ahead and fact check.
Yeah.
I think the basic idea behind what we're saying is honest, but we don't always remember all of the little
That's
details.
my understanding as well, though. That is my understanding that they also reversed their position. And yeah, Starbucks is canceled. There's a couple companies that make it evident that they are not for Black people. Starbucks being one of them, Chick-fil-A being one of them. I don't know if you guys seen that video that was circulating Twitter. It was something about something along the lines of, yes, we know why slavery is bad, but white people never truly reaped the benefits of slavery. And that's something you can Google. I was gonna say, yeah, fact check me on that one, but there's definitely. But then I seen the Dove ad, and I seen the Nike ad, and I want to say it was Reebok, and these are companies that have historically Black bases. And I would like to think maybe it's the optimist in me, because of, especially in Nike's case, their history of advocacy for Black causes, that it is genuine. And I think that you can tell the difference between, in the messaging, especially, like, if you read the Reebok message, you could tell it was not something that they just said, we support Black Lives Matter, and had somebody post it. It was definitely well thought out.
And it suggests that we need to do our homework, right? Look into the history of these corporations. What have they done? What is the racial demographics within their company? Who are their products for, et cetera?
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Like, talk is cheap. Anybody can talk, and I guess I'm glad that corporations that wouldn't have talked before are saying something now, but that really doesn't mean anything. I know that I've liked to see organizations that do have actual policy changes within what they can control. I think of like Ben & Jerry's seems to really, really genuinely care about this, and they're pushing the dialogue in ways that white America probably isn't ready for when they're talking about things like reparations and stuff like that. And actually they have like a plan that their corporation can participate in. And that to me is where, as far as I can discern, there seems to be actual effort versus just like a friend of mine recently said he doesn't care what the intern that runs social media, that runs Twitter for Wendy's says or whatever. He wants to see what the CEO is going to do.
And thanks for bringing up Ben & Jerry's, because I know for a very long time they've had pages on their website, links about institutionalized racism and resources to read and things about white privilege. So they have played a role in educating and also putting their money where their mouth is to some extent. I don't know to what extent, but yeah, different kinds of corporations.
Yeah, and I think that's what people like myself need to understand is Ben & Jerry's seems like they've been in the fight for a while, so we can probably I can learn some things from that versus somebody who's just stepping in right now, which would be more along the lines of who I am, is to see what the marathon looks like versus what the sprint looks like.
Yeah, and I don't know if people have heard of this, but there are companies that are defined as B Corps, B corporations, and they make a commitment then to advancing sustainability, social justice, consumer or corporate responsibility. And you can look up the B corporations online, and it will list the businesses, and then you can go look into what they're actually doing a bit more. But it's interesting to see, some efforts taking place.
There's a lot to cover there between everyone. So
Go ahead.
Hopefully, I can keep it succinct. A couple things that came to mind initially were when you mentioned Chick-fil-A, Shay, about, white people didn't benefit from slavery of any sort. That, I feel, is when we talk about reaching people who are, not necessarily educated on a lot of different things, whether it be Black Lives Matter or Pride or whatever it may be. That, to me, I feel is the biggest difference maker on how conversations can go. If we can't agree upon the history of the country and where that has led us now, then the rest of it is just going to fall on deaf ears from both sides. Because if one person is saying, like, hey, there's tons of evidence to show that this has been, whether it be slave patrols and how that's affected our modern police, or the economic status behind people who have had, old money from slavery and so on and so forth, and how that affects people currently. If we can't agree upon that, and the structural racism going all the way back for hundreds of years, then we're going to struggle to have any sort of dialogue. I'll be the opposite of the optimist on this one, which is the pessimist, which is to say that I feel like the co-opted movement, quote unquote, by corporations has been more recent with Black Lives Matter, but I feel started years ago with Pride Month, with someone just changing their avatar to, the LGBTQ flag, and being like, all right, that's good enough. And as an effort for, Mr. and Mrs. Capitalism to make a buck off people who feel like, Walmart put their flag and logo up with the LGBTQ flag that they're okay to shop with because they're woke, quote unquote. Yeah, there's certain corporations that actually do mean it, but it's not just a month-long thing. It's not a recent, it's not a recent fight where it's like, oh, since, George Floyd's death or Philando Castile's death or anyone like that, that it's something that we can just participate in. And sometimes I roll my eyes when I see it. I play a fair amount of video games, and there's several video game developers, whenever I log on to the game or whatever, that says, we stand with Black Lives Matter, and blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, great, what actions are being taken behind that besides just putting it up? Which I know it already makes people mad from having to see that. But, just throwing up a Twitter post isn't enough. And I think, just to kind of close things out, I love the NBA to death, the basketball as a whole. They're the most progressive league that we have in our American society. But with the players saying, okay, we can come back and we can finish our season and all this other stuff, and as much as I'd love basketball to come back, I've had several conversations with people about they want to sit out to a certain extent to say, what can we make the NBA do better? And you mentioned earlier, Xander, some of their demands, for lack of better words, was like partner more with Black-owned businesses in the local arenas, donate more to causes and movements that need it. And for me, I feel like even like I said, as much as I want it to come back, they need to use their power to say, all right, don't just say you stand with us and you give us more of a platform to speak than any other league. You give us more opportunities to speak our minds on politics, whether they be for something we represent. But put your money where your mouth is and actually support us, because the league is like 70 to 80% Black. So help us, and more than just giving us a platform, because that's great, but there needs to be more. So I feel like that in and of itself is how corporations can show they're more than just putting up a Twitter post or a Facebook post and calling it good.
After you bring up sports, it makes me think of, because you bring up a really interesting point in that the NBA is 60-70% Black. Same case with the NFL. But I don't know if you guys recently seen the NASCAR demonstration where the Black driver had. So I think that the NBA and the NFL could for sure take a few tips from NASCAR, because the immediate, but you laugh, but the immediate show of solidarity, especially from that demographic, is surprising. And it is embarrassing to see Roger Goodell has not said anything after his players made a viral video. Our lives matter, and you can't even make a comment on that. And it speaks to how much we as Black people pay into systems that don't reward us.
Totally.
I think he might have made a comment actually.
Oh,
You might
really?
look that up. I think
Oh,
he,
I need to.
I think he like apologized and said that the NFL got it wrong, but Colin Kaepernick still doesn't have a job, so
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
that speaks for itself.
Yeah,
a
he
little
did.
bit.
He did. He definitely said like it took him a while.
Yeah, it was
but
delayed.
you know,
for sure.
I forgot when Kaepernick. It was 2016, 2015, around about in there.
It was 16, 17, I
was
think.
it, where for those that as a huge sports historian, that's not the first time that's happened in any league. I mean, you can go back to Craig Hodges back for the brother for the Bulls.
Yeah, Craig Hodges is right.
Craig Hodges, Muhammad Ali, where you take a stand that someone doesn't agree with, and you lose your ability to play the sport you love or do the sport you love and have a platform. So it's a huge risk. But I laughed at the NASCAR thing because it's just like, wow, we live in a time where NASCAR is leading the front on racial understanding, when it's typically like, they had to get rid of the Confederate flag and all sorts of stuff like that. And I completely agree. I think I boycotted the NFL and have been for a long time because of how they treated Cap. I don't want to hear anything about, because it's the same narrative that has been for a long time. It's like, well, his skills diminished. Bro, I can get out there and throw passes better than some of the backups. So I don't want to hear it about Cap. I don't want to hear it about other people like that.
I boycotted for the cheating. So.
Well, I think, I don't know. For me, I feel as if the people, what's that? I'm sorry, you just giggled a couple times, so I wasn't. So I think for me, it has to come down to, don't sit here and lie to my face and tell me it's something when it's very clearly something not. That it's not. And with Goodell, it's lie to my face and say we got it wrong. It's like, no, I don't think that you got it wrong, which is true, and then from an objective sense, you got it wrong. But now the outcry is so large, you're willing to change your mind on something. And that is a huge crux for me. Is like, are you changing the system because you want people to shut up, or because you actually understand that this is a problem and it needs to change? And I feel like it's more the former than the latter a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're probably right with Roger Goodell. I don't know him personally, obviously,
Sure.
but what do you think it would look like if what would convince you that it was genuine? Or somebody like that, doesn't have to be him specifically.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know if that ship on sailed on as far as Roger goes. For me, it takes humility, and I think some people, I don't know if it's a toxic masculinity thing as a whole, but it takes humility, and sometimes people confuse that with submissiveness or control or fear, and it's like, nah, I understand that I did something wrong, or I didn't do something right, and I messed up, even though you can still say, like, at the time, this is what I thought, and now I understand that I'm wrong, and I feel that's different than saying, like, we got it wrong, here's what we're going to do to fix it, versus, like, I made this decision, I messed up, we messed up because of these reasons, and I see now for these reasons that it's wrong, as opposed to just, like, my bad, let's fix it. And I don't know if it seems like it's not a huge distinction, but I feel like it's a subtle enough distinction that people will be able to tell the difference.
It's accountability and the difference between the two ways you just stated it. One is actively saying, I did this, and the other is, it's the difference between passive and active voice is saying mistakes were made versus I made a mistake. There's accountability in the latter.
So one thing I've been thinking about is you've had this dialogue about professional sports, which I know absolutely nothing about. and for me, that has a lot to do around masculinity and gender dynamics and race dynamics. But being situated at a university, I've been seeing some of what's happening at universities around the country. And overall, of course, COVID-19 has, led to huge cuts in funding that universities will receive and fewer students. I've heard estimates of anywhere from 5 to 15% fewer students starting this coming fall. And so, figuring out how to manage budgets is just excruciating, hearing about the kind of furloughs and layoffs being made around the country. But I recently heard a proposal, and I can only speak to my university and university system. I'm sure this is going around other places in the country, where it has been suggested that the football coach at CU Boulder and president and chancellors take a 50% temporary pay cut next year. And whereas in this case, they've committed to a 10% pay cut. But we have, well, I won't go there, right? But it's something to think about. How much is enough for someone to make, or a corporation to bring in as profits, to, you know, make a commitment to cut that back, even for 1 year temporarily, right, to be able to provide more scholarships for students, right, lower tuition for students, put more money into ethnic studies programs and, you know, Black Student Union, and of those, you know, organizations that are essential on our campus. And students need more support now than ever, right, particularly students of color. And so I'm wondering what your observations are, and, you know, maybe in terms of universities and in terms of other institutions in our nation.
In my experience, I've seen a lot of upper administrative. I have fostered, my political science department at my college is very small. It's only a couple, 3 or 4 teachers, I believe. So we foster very intimate relationships, and you get to know these people very well, especially after 3-4 years of having conversations. And you start to hear, of course, rumblings about the institution that they work for, but a lot of common threads are that the teachers seem to get the last of everything else, which is just an echo of what's going on nationally in other educational institutions. And upper administrative positions are receiving more and more funding for doing less and less actual work. And I think that, I kind of lost my point.
That's okay.
I think that you have to, I honestly would prefer to see what people would rather do. If you would rather only take a 10% pay cut because that's how much your Black students mean to you, I'd prefer to see 10% of the Black students drop out of the university, and let's see how the football team does then. Honestly, and that's how I genuinely feel.
Great point, great. Thank you for being honest.
Yeah.
Right, and I've also read in the news that for some schools that will not have teams actively playing next year, those students that are there on scholarships, sports scholarships, will not get their scholarships next year. And so, as you're saying, you know, many African American students and very low income students who depend on those scholarships will likely have to drop out.
And you see it happens all the time. Even without COVID, you see that injuries happen or relationships with coaches don't develop as they should, and people are just up a creek without a paddle trying to pay tens of thousands of dollars for an education that they can no longer afford, and they have no choice but to drop out. So I feel like that's a whole other banana is dealing with the treatment of Black athletes in higher institutions of higher learning. But
Well, feel free to talk about that other banana as well.
That's
wherever you want to go with this.
Yeah, that's certainly a long dissertation for sure. I would say maybe on a smaller level, I had a conversation with someone who their wife is upper administration for District 2, I believe, and mentioned, they were like, oh, you know, they get paid, I think there was like $145,000 a year. And I was like, great, you know, we need to pay teachers a reasonable amount. But the conversation devolved quickly into, I was like, you know, they were like, it's the poorest school district in the area. The person that they were at, I believe it was Harrison School District. It's the poor school district. She gets paid $145,000, and he was saying she deserves it, which she does to a certain extent, because she deals with a lot of unruly students, and no one wants to be with those students. And he used a lot of code words. It's the urban students that they don't want to deal with. It's the students of, you know, blah, 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 blah. And I was just like, okay, and we were talking about pay cuts. This was well before COVID. This was a couple years ago, and I was like, if she still can get paid 6 figures, $45,000 is a lot of money for that school, for any school district. I mean, that's new computers, that's new textbooks, and that's a huge problem with, again, historically, with a lot of predominantly low-income school districts, is textbooks issues being out of date and so on and so forth. And, you know, for all of us that have attended college textbooks are an arm and a leg. And you go down a leg further to high school, you know, $45,000 is a lot of money. She still gets to make 6 figures. She still gets paid what she deserves for dealing with unruly kids or kids that people know wants to deal with or whatever. But he was arguing like, no, she deserves that money. The school doesn't need that money. She deserves that money. I'm like, you know, we can take away from the athletics department, and yes, it brings in more money, but at a certain point, it's like, how much is enough? And we can move on to other things that need it more. And I feel that way with a lot of athletes that make a tremendous amount of money, or anyone that makes a tremendous amount of money. How much is enough? Because that can solve a lot of problems in other areas. And do you really need that much? And teachers are underfunded just the regular math teacher who doesn't do anything else are underfunded. We all understand that, but I feel like at a certain point when we get to like upper administration that's getting paid to us, at colleges, high schools, and so on, let's allocate that money in different directions that needs it. And I don't want to hear anything about, well, the budget doesn't allow it, because it's clearly allowing you to be paid. And so you don't necessarily get what you deserve. You get what you have the leverage to negotiate for. And a lot of those people will negotiate for higher salaries because they can, as opposed to not thinking about the greater overall high school or university.
I think it would also depend on what they're doing with the money. Like if you're a CEO and you have 4 yachts, like maybe think what you're doing with your money before you buy a 5th. Like that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but like you see how many houses some of these people have. Like, I'm all for being able to like live comfortably, like being able to retire, whatever. But I don't understand why you need so much wealth. Like what are you trying to accomplish with that? Like what's the point? And I think money can be so much better utilized in like pockets of people who need it.
Anyone want to add to that?
Wealth distribution is atrocious. There's no reason for famine to exist or for there to be poverty when money isn't real. It's something that has value because we said it has value. And I think that there's trillionaires on the planet, which means there's individuals that have higher net worths than entire nations, and that's ridiculous to me as well. So I don't know if that makes me a socialist or whatever. But,
Maybe just a little bit.
And that's go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just going to add that, economics is obviously very relevant to this conversation. And I remember a few years ago I had heard, actually, Ben and Jerry's again had like I don't remember the proper term, I'm a creative writing major, but it was something like they had like a ratio for their pay scale where the highest paid person, the CEO, could only make whatever the number was, like 6 to 1 to what the lowest paid person could make. I don't know if they still do that or not, but I think that type of action and behavior can create the inequality. It'll slim it down at least. It's not going to solve everything, but it still incentivizes you to become the CEO if you have the ability to do so. But it doesn't make it unlivable to be a custodian or whatever the case may be. And I feel like corporations need to be moving in that direction, and if they're not, which it doesn't seem like anybody's super interested in that, I think that's where politics come into play, whether it's socialism or whatever.
Thank you. And I think that, I think you and Shay both brought up an excellent point that, does this mean you're socialist, right? And we know that that's because a lot of people would accuse you of that, but of course it's not socialist, right? And we in our nation have, one of the largest gaps between the most wealthy, 0.1%, even 0.01%, and everyone else, or those in the bottom 50%. It's huge, and you don't see that in European countries and others. Also, going back to higher ed, I wanted to comment that, looking at K through 12, we see a dramatic difference, but then looking at higher ed, we see the very top administrators and coaches making in the multiple hundreds of thousands,
How much the Penn State president makes?
What, Xander?
The Penn State president, I think he takes home like almost $1 million, if not like a year, and that's like,
yes,
that's ludicrous.
Yeah, and that's the reality in many schools around that number. And all public universities, salaries are public. You can look them up, right? And so as a method of educating yourself, I encourage people to do that. And then to look at the diversity or lack of diversity among the upper levels of administration. And we know that administrative positions have gone up over the past decade, while hiring new faculty has not kept pace. And I also want to point out it's really important to look at not just the educators' salaries, right? But the maintenance folks, right? The people cleaning our offices every day, what are they making, right? And so there's a lot that we need to educate ourselves about. And another thing I would recommend is looking at the percentage of faculty of color at universities around the country. I don't believe that has changed very much at all in the past decade, right? And so thinking about that, whole pipeline is essential, right? To think about what universities can do differently. Anyone want to add to that?
I would. So,
Go ahead.
It's really interesting that those are the notes that you make because, and I have no problem, I was going to say making waves. So Colorado State University Pueblo has plans to become the People's University by 2028, I believe. And yet we see increasing amounts of black students and yet stagnation in black faculty. I want to say there's actually less than when I began, but I've only ever seen one. So that's just from what other people have told me. I only know one black administrator, and she is the dean of students, and there are countless administrators that I've never even met. So it's interesting to see how they have this forward-facing, we are the people of the Southwest, and yet there is no people of the Southwest in your upper administration. There is no people of the Southwest in your faculty. And we're in Pueblo, Colorado, so there's plenty of people of color around. So it's just...
I feel like that's, across the board, even outside of the hopefully it doesn't bore some people, but to go back to the sports realm, that's pretty consistent within the sports realm too, of like leagues that are predominantly African American that have head coaches and administrations, or not administrations, but front offices and ownership that is predominantly white, as opposed to a league that, and it's like, I don't want to hear qualifications because, some people can't coach even if they play, but like those people understand the game. They spent years, living and breathing it. So are they not qualified to, because you'll get other former white athletes that get to be front office members and coaches and given less opportunities. And the NFL has the Rooney Rule, which allows they have to interview at least one black coach. But that's across the board. It's not just sports. It's education. It's general workplace practices of people who are totally qualified not being given chances. And if you want to go all the way back to the systemic oppression, it can go down to like, I'm not afforded a certain education because I don't live in a great city, and that my school doesn't get get grants or doesn't get good funding, and so therefore I don't get as good enough education. I can't go to a certain college, and so therefore I can't do X, Y, Z to be put into position to be an upper level administrator or a journalist, at certain places, or an executive. So it has to change from top to bottom in order for people to achieve the goals that we're talking about, but you also have to give people opportunities, and it's just more so, it's both. It's not mutually exclusive for sure.
Adding to what you said, the amount of student loans that we know people come out with is just staggering. So I think this is a great time for us to take a 5-minute break. Everyone can stretch, and everyone out there listening, I hope that you will take this time to post some questions, and when we come back, we'll turn to answering questions and entertaining questions from the audience here and our online community. And we're going to be listening to a song by Corey, who is working here with us on all of the technology, and his band.
Float like a buffalo.
Yes, Float Like a Buffalo. I had to look for that. It's a little hard to remember. Float Like a Buffalo. Actually, it should be really easy to remember. And this is a local Denver band and a song that they have written called Sunday Afternoon. We'll be back shortly. Are we off?
Sit and listen to the sounds. Sit and listen all around. Sit and watch the clouds go. Sit and watch the rain fall. Sit and listen to the sounds. Another Sunday afternoon when everything's so blue, and I'm thinking of you. Walking tall, pale moonlight. Walking tall, say you might. Sit and listen to the sounds of the raindrops coming down. Sit and listen all around to another Sunday afternoon when everything's so blue, and I'm thinking of you. Come on and tell me what you want me to do when I don't have a clue. I'll listen to you. It's just a Sunday afternoon when everything's so blue, and I'm thinking of you. Come on and tell me what you want me to do when I don't have a clue. I'll listen to you. Listen to you. I'll listen to you. I'll listen to you. I'll listen to you. I'll listen to Stepping off on the river outside, I'm back from nowhere. Headstrong, but my heads have gone. I'm back from nowhere. Do you remember when you told me once we're going somewhere? Open up and walk through the door. I'm finding somewhere.
Okay, and anyone here who wants to ask a question? We have a microphone right up there to come to. Come on, don't be shy. Okay. Any questions come in that we should? Okay,
No,
yeah,
no
you-
problem.
or you can read it into the microphone. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, something too close down that please. All right.
Okay, so earlier, right towards the beginning, Trey mentioned police interactions as kind of an aside. And this person was wondering if you would be willing to tell about your own personal experiences with police living in Colorado Springs or wherever you've had your own experiences.
I recently had a discussion with the same group of people we were talking about before. I've had several interactions with the police, majority negative, unfortunately. Just to keep it as brief as possible, I think I was about 19 or 20. I was taking my then girlfriend and her sister. We're going to Sacramento. We're in Utah, so I'm already on edge. And we're driving her car. It's horrible, cracked windshield, 600,000 miles on her, whatever. And, there's two semis in the right-hand lane. About 3 or 4 of us cars try to pass them. So we're all probably going about 5 over, trying to pass these semis. I'm the one that gets pulled over. A police officer comes up, instantly tells me to put my hands on the dashboard, even though it's not like they were in my pockets or off to the sides or anything. They're on the steering wheel. They're, on the steering wheel, tells me to put my hands on the dashboard, leans in, asks, my girlfriend and her sister were white, and, are you ladies safe? Do you know this man? Are you in danger? Before he even asked me any questions, anything like that. That's the first thing he goes for. And I'm praying to God because my girlfriend's sister's a jokester. I'm praying to God she doesn't make a joke about it. Because at this point I'm like, all right, he's already on guard for no reason. Asked me if I have weapons in the car, or drugs in the car, takes me out of the car, pulls me over to his vehicle and says, spread your arms, spread your legs, pats me down, asks for my ID, gives me the runaround about, well, you had a cracked windshield, you were going 5 over. And then part of me is like, I know at this point my parents had to talk with me, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, just make sure you're coming home. And at this point, again, I'm scared to death because I'm in Utah. I have no advocate for me. It's just me. I think, if anything goes down, I'm going to be out here by myself. There's no one's going to help me at all. My parents are going to find out somehow if anything does happen to me. He's like, all right, well, you were going too fast and your windshield's cracked. Just go ahead and get back in the car. I'm like, all that for the windshield being cracked and going too fast? And there was 3 or 4 other cars. They had white drivers. They were going just as fast because we're all trying to pass these semis. That's experience number 1. Experience number 2, being pulled over in the Springs, going to class at UCCS. I was speeding again because I was late for my lab. And, same thing, hands on the dashboard instantly. This is right on, for those that know the Springs, this is right on that overpass they just built at the bottom of Union and Austin Bluffs. Hands on the dashboard. Do you have weapons in the car? Are there drugs? All sorts of stuff like that. And that's been the 5 out of the 7 times I've been pulled over. It's always, do you have weapons? Are you a threat? Hands on the dashboard instantly. Eventually, every single black man I've known in my life has had that exact same experience for the most part. Sometimes it changes depending on where they're at, but my consistent argument with that is people that's just like, oh, that's just anecdotal. Well, at what point do me, my dad, my brother, my other brother, my sister, my brother-in-law, my cousins, uncles all have to deal with this so that it's not anecdotal anymore, and it just becomes, evidence of systemic racism. So I could keep going, but we'll just leave it at those 2.
Others want to comment on Trey's experience or share their own?
I mean, just to contrast that, I haven't been pulled over very many times, and I'm willing to bet I've rode with Trey. I don't think I drive any better than him. And I think of a time when I got pulled over. Well, I was a passenger with a friend of mine who's also white, and we were 18 at the time, and driving up past Woodland Park, going to Divide. We worked at a summer camp, and we were past curfew already for when we were supposed to get back to the camp or whatever. So he's booking it like 70 miles an hour through Divide, which goes down to like 30 or something like that. So we're like double where we're supposed to be. And a cop pulls us over, and we had more people in the vehicle than what was legal. Some of us were in the back, not in a seat, not buckled in. And he did ask the driver to step out. He's a friend of mine named John. He asked John to step out, and he did talk with him, but there was no checking for weapons. There was no, those questions didn't happen. Maybe he was asked if he was drunk, which he hadn't been drinking, so that was a non-factor. But he literally just had a personal chat with him, didn't ask anybody else in the car if we were safe or whatever the case may be, and said, "Oh, you work at the camp up the road. Just go on. Don't worry about it." We were going like 40 miles an hour over. Like, he didn't even get ticketed. He got off with a warning. There was nothing. So, I mean, I'm just wanting to say, like, obviously there is a stark difference in experience there. There's no reason why we should have gotten off with any type of warning or whatever. We basically did everything wrong.
Yeah, and I imagine you never have to live with that fear of being pulled over.
I wasn't even afraid then. I guess I was afraid to like get in trouble or whatever, but I certainly didn't have any fear for my life or harm at all.
I mean, like, as a trans person, like, I have my own experience with the cops, but a note I wanted to make was a lot of time when we talk about the police departments, we're talking about, like, the evidence, we talk about, like, the deaths. But I know a lot of people who say, like, we should really be looking at, like, how many times the cops are even, like, trying to grab their gun, like, they're going for it. I mean, they may not have fired, but isn't that something to indicate that there's something racist occurring in our system?
Yeah. I have two stories. One talks about discrimination in police departments. The other one just talks about how unsafe it can be for women with police. I was in North Dakota with my boyfriend at the time, who is from northern Mexico, and it's my car, I'm driving. We get stopped, I pull over. The cop goes to my side, sees I'm in the front driver's seat, goes around to where my boyfriend's at, and basically asks to roll down the window, so roll it down. I say I have my license and registration, and all his questions were just for my ex at the time. You know, just asking him, like, okay, well, how do you guys know each other, and what are you doing here, and things like that. And no questions for me, even though he could see it's my vehicle. And then at one point he does ask him, like, oh, like, are you a citizen? You know, he asks that to my boyfriend at the time. And, you know, that was up in North Dakota. And then driving back down, I was driving through a small town, going about 5 over the speed limit. A cop pulls me over. He pulls me over, I give him my license and registration, and then he asks me to go sit in the passenger seat of his car. And I ask why. And he says, oh, I just do it with everybody. It's just, that's the way I like to do it. And I felt very uncomfortable with that, you know, because that's not normal protocol. I've never heard of that before, but he insists. So I go to his side, and I just try to stand by the door. He insists I sit down. So I sit down. I leave the door open. I leave my legs, like, out of the door. And he could tell I was very uncomfortable. And so nothing happened with that situation, but the fact that that cop felt comfortable doing that to a woman, and I'm white, so imagine how many times for black women that happens continuously and how much worse it can get. You know, and for him, it was just, like, normal. So, yeah, I just... yeah, I don't have any faith in our police because of a lot of situations, but that's one. So.
And certainly, the various important points Trey made, there is a whole lot of research to support all of that, right? So we know people may treat these phenomena as anecdotal evidence, but there is a lot of research out there, they call it driving while black, that African Americans, Latinos, other people of color, but especially African Americans, get pulled over at much higher rates than others, and then more than white people in particular. I drove for 2 years with a broken windshield, and I know I went over the speed limit during that time, and I was never, ever pulled over. So, thank you for sharing that story, Trey. So, a question that we have from someone online is, how do we move from brave conversations to meaningful actions? And so I think talking to part of that process, right, what really needs to happen. And I would also like to hear more about what kinds of actions you think people can take just in their daily life, within the institutions they move in and interact in, right? Schools, universities, workplaces, prisons, people who work in any of these variety of places, hospitals, healthcare. What can people do within those systems? Anyone? It's open for anyone.
I think the biggest thing most people can do is hold your heart. Like if you see something wrong, say something. Talk. If you're a teacher, you can talk to your students in a way that you can reach the ones that don't get to have those conversations at home. Every person, depending on what they currently do, they can do a little bit something. And then I forgot the rest of the question.
Well, no, and do any of you think that individuals can contribute to making institutional change?
I 100% feel that way. In my experience, I was going to say, I keep saying that I feel as though for every question, because that's all I can speak to, but one individual who is focused and clear in their goal can make a lot of change, and that is evident. There's one man history, and that's just so I think that more than anything speaks to the ability of one person. So no one should ever feel as though I'm just one person, I can't do anything, because people feeling that way is the reason why we haven't accomplished anything yet. So do your work, whatever that means for you. Not everyone is supposed to be a leader. Not everyone is supposed to be on the front lines, but know what doing the work means for you and take that work seriously. So, and I was going to say, I am a political science student, so I would be remiss if not to say, hold your locally elected officials accountable. Like your police chief is locally elected, your mayor is locally elected, and in Colorado Springs, those are the entities that control our policing. So it's so much more than just having conversations. There's real actionable things that you can do. Like know who your representatives are. Contact them, because if you contact them, they're probably going to reply to you. So just take it one step further and actually do something. Look into what you can do, because there's steps to be taken.
In that same role as the opposite of a political science major, I'd say it's still to me at a young age is to vote, plain and simple. I know that seems like an easy answer, but all those things that you're talking about with elected officials in the Springs recently, I don't know if anyone knows, but our governor passed the bill about police reform in terms of body cam footage, and everyone has to have a body cam, qualified immunities out of the window, so on and so forth, no chokeholds. But for those in the Springs, our sheriff, Bill Elder, specifically said he was kind of iffy about it. And that's on top of him earlier saying that he wasn't going to uphold the red flag law. So we need to vote for, even if we do pass that reform, there are elected officials that's deciding, nah, that's not for me. And I feel like voting those people out of office or running for that type of office, not everyone's supposed to be a leader like you mentioned, but voting against those people, voting for people who are advocates for the people as a whole makes a difference. That's the big, and the immediate action you can take is calling your representatives, ask them about where they stand on issues, doing research, and that's tiring for some people. It's not fun, it feels like you're doing a research paper, but it's something you have to do in order to make sure we're in a better society, as opposed to just voting along a party lines, which in and of itself needs to be changed. But you know, that is the big actions you can take, and sometimes you can just throw money at it if you're available. I mean, donating to like the NAACP, donating to the AA, I forgot what they're ACLU. Yes, thank you. Donating to like local chapters of fraternities and sororities that are actively putting out scholarships for people, and so on and so forth. That if you feel like you can only contribute monetarily, and then having difficult conversations like you mentioned with parents, siblings, friends, and not just letting it go by because you don't want to make the dinner table awkward. So,
Thank you.
I also think with the economic factors, supporting Black-owned businesses and businesses that are owned by people of color, it might not feel like it makes a huge difference right off the bat, but if you're going to give somebody $20 for your lunch or whatever, give it to somebody who will actually benefit from it instead of a CEO for Taco Bell or whatever the case may be. That was very specific.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
But yeah, I mean, that's a part of this, an element of this is the economic disparity. So if you can even do your small part to contribute, moving that in the right direction too.
Thank you. It doesn't even have to be actively spending. I think that people don't realize the power of their dollar all the time, and the boycott is a very effective means of making institutional change. It's been historically proven. I was going to say, you see it's enough to make companies change their position within hours of news coming out that they don't really stand for what they claim to. So be mindful where you spend your money, especially Black people. Do not continue to line the pockets of people who feed into your hatred, because at that point, it's just self-hate.
Any other comments on that? I was going to add that it's very easy to look online and search for Black-owned businesses, Black-owned restaurants in your local community or corporations, and so there's no excuse not to, right? It's at our fingertips. I even went and looked online at Etsy, and I was looking up who was selling Black Lives Matter yard signs and window signs, and you can look up Black-owned businesses, but the majority of people selling them were not Black-owned, and they were these, you know, really fairly large audience businesses that produce signage, and you could look at all the other signs they produce that, you know, show no support of anti-racist work. And so, again, thinking about the commodification of the movement, right? And supporting those who are actively involved.
I would also kind of agree to the go to Black-owned businesses, because as someone who went to a lot of Black-owned businesses, restaurants and stuff growing up in the Springs, 99% of the time it always went, this is great food, and then it'd be closed within the next like 2 or 3 months. And I worked in the banking industry for a while. Food restaurants, when I try to give loans to food people, that was typically the biggest. Someone always wants to make a restaurant, and those go out really quickly. A lot of things go into that, but for Black-owned businesses, it's much, much faster. And it's nothing to do with the quality of the food or anything like that, or quality of the place. I mean, it's people just don't go to it for whatever reason. So yeah, supporting your Black-owned businesses locally is a huge deal.
What do you think those reasons are? What do you think those reasons are? Sorry.
In the Springs, I'd say, well, without getting too wild with it, I'd say the location is important, because most of the places we go to are down south, on the south side of the Springs. But also people are just going to see it as Black-owned and instantly be turned off because various reasons, like, oh, I don't think this is the food I want to eat. This isn't, I've heard one of my homeboys say, like, it's just not authentic because they're from, New York, and they're selling Southern style food. And I'm like, my pops is from New York, you know what I mean? He makes great food. So all sorts of ridiculous reasons. But for me, it's usually location, because they don't want to go down south.
I think it's a fear of trying new things sometimes too. Like I don't have any home experience with like soul food or anything like that. now I've had the opportunity to try some, and I love it, and I want to go back. But I think it's people being scared of new things sometimes too.
It's just food.
Yeah.
So there's a number of questions that have come in from listeners. In the midst of Pride Month, how can we honor Pride and pursue equality for the LGBTQIA community while also honoring Black Lives Matter? Should we do both or set aside one for the other?
Well, Black lives can't matter until all Black lives matter. I was going to say Black trans lives matter, Black gay lives matter, and even just the history of Pride. I believe the first Pride parade at Stonewall was a Black woman, was a Black gay woman. So just know the history truly, because they all intersect and they are all intertwined.
Yeah, Mike, additionally, the numbers for Black trans women that get murdered every year is just startling, and I think the month of Pride is a really good month to celebrate who you are, celebrate diversity, but it's also a really important time to remember the people before you, remembering you should remember, and then I blank out on the name, right? Sylvia. People have done so much work in order to get us where we are now, and a lot of those people are Black trans women in particular. And they have constantly been left out of the Pride, Pride celebrations, and I think now would be a really great time to just start trying to focus more on them this month in particular, with the Black Lives Matter movement happening now. But intersectionality is a great answer for that question.
And that intersectionality doesn't just mean, as many often assume, thinking about gender, thinking about race, thinking about disability, thinking about religion. It means looking literally at the intersections, right? And focusing on race, thinking about the multiple identities of Black people, multiple identities of white people, multiple identities of trans people, etc., that end up marginalizing certain groups within the larger classification. So here's another question. What are some higher ed classroom changes you would like to see moving forward?
CSU Pueblo has no African American Studies courses. They have one, I believe it's called Civil Rights. I took it as an upper division history course, and that is the only classroom setting in which things like this are the focal point of the course, which is highly disappointing, once again, because I've already brought up the fact that CSU Pueblo has a pretty significant African American population. We have women's studies, we have Chicano studies, but we don't have African American studies. And it's not necessarily a slight, but it's definitely noticeable. So that, at the very least, I would like to see.
I think for my degree in creative writing, which again was online, it wasn't through a Colorado State school, but it's probably similar. I believe I had one class that was focused on authors who are people of color, but that was just one course. And then through my normal classes, my more standard classes, there were very few uses of books by Black authors, which very easily could have fit into those classes too. So it almost felt a little bit like that one course was kind of like a tokenism type thing or something, whereas we could have easily it's a good idea to have that class, but we didn't need that one class if we would have integrated those works into the other classes we had to take anyway.
I know UCCS, the Mosaic Office, which is the Multicultural Office for Student Inclusivity and Access, I think.
Something like that.
They have these safe zones where they go around and they educate faculty on different LGBT things and students as well. And if you want to do certain things, you have to attend an LGBT safe zone. And having something like that for people of color, I think would be useful, especially hearing some of the really racist things some professors at UCCS are saying. They definitely need to be educated, so they're teaching their students how to be good citizens. I think and there's a lot of other stuff higher education can do, like scholarships, just having like space available, watching out like who they hire and why they're hiring, thinking about like what course materials they're using.
Oh, and I meant to add, I had never had a black professor or a black teacher going my entire education from kindergarten all the way through, and it's not just because of the areas I lived in or anything like that. So more leadership as well.
Yeah, professors, teachers as well, because it's one thing to have the course, but it's another thing if the course is being taught by, you know, if I'm taking African American studies from someone who's Caucasian. You know, hiring in those practices, that needs to change. And making sure that the history is correct and not what we want it to be, because I definitely know I spent, because both my parents being huge historians, a lot of times in history classes, in K through 12, basically being like, yeah, that's not what happened, or we're completely missing a huge section of quote unquote American history, or that's not how, you know, and I feel like that's pretty par for the course across a lot of the country. You can go to different examples of Juneteenth, which to me was something I celebrated every year with the family, whether it be going to, you know, outdoor concerts, celebrating locally, going to picnics, whatever it may be. That's something my family celebrated regularly, but if I mentioned that's what I was doing that weekend with some friends, they'd be like, what? What is this? Or if I mentioned, you know, the Black Wall Street bombing or anything like that, or, you know, just a lot of stuff that's left out for whatever reason, several reasons I'm sure, that needs to be taught. And I feel like that gets left out a lot in the lower educations, but, you know, upper education as well. It's just revisionist history to a certain extent. And you can't learn how to go forward if you can't agree upon what the actual history was and how to avoid it going forward. So.
Well, I want to acknowledge that it's now 2 o'clock for anyone that needs to leave. If not, I have 2 more questions that I'd love to ask you to answer, but if any of the panelists need to leave, that's perfectly understandable. Okay, thank you. Thank you for continuing to share your time. So here's the first. Basically, can you give us advice regarding dealing with difficult conversations with friends and family? Most specifically, family. And a number of you have referred to doing that. Have you found any tactics help? Have you found them all worthwhile? What would you advise others?
I think with any conversation, part of what you have to do is also listen. So like when I would have, I'm not going to name any names or anybody, sure. But I was having like an argument with somebody and they're telling me, well, more white people are killed by the police. Like, look at the stats. So like my response has to be like coming at them with numbers and like explaining what those numbers mean and how they came to be. But like when I'm talking to like somebody younger or somebody who's less analytical, I might use examples like, well, look at this person, like look at somebody in your life and think about this kind of scenario. Like it's not, you can't just yell at somebody like it's stop being racist. Like, they're not going to listen to you. I wouldn't listen if somebody's yelling at me either. But you have to come to them in a way where they're going to be able to come to you as well.
I think a lot of people, especially in their intimate relationships, are having to have these very difficult conversations for the very first time. And especially it being, there's an obvious to me, generational shift in thinking between our parents' generation and ours. And it seems as though there was a lot more complacency, possibly because our generation before us had seen what was then, it was unforeseen prosperity. Like they were doing well. We've seen more black people moving into middle class situations versus being in poverty after being subjected for so long. And they kind of became complacent. and they felt as though the only way that they should ask for things is incrementally and by small pieces and make change one thing at a time, whereas we have a sense of fire and urgency and things need to be changed right now. And that is something when you are trying to speak to people that are in a different cohort than you, you have to keep in mind. So I've had this conversation with my parents on both ends, and they've both expressed it to me in different ways, is that we're just tired. And when you're trying to, I'm definitely more abrasive than the average person, and I'm definitely the person that's gonna say what I have to say no matter what. And I have no problems. Like, I love to debate, and I love to have conversations where valid points are heard on both sides. But if you feel as though you're getting to a point where you're asking valid questions and you're not receiving answers, you have to take a step back and analyze how much of that is worth your personal effort, because you can only educate a person that wants to be educated.
Thank you.
I also think something that's been swirling in my mind recently is I'm not a confrontational person. It makes me uncomfortable. And first off, I know that that's a place of privilege, that I can feel that way and know that it doesn't affect me like it may affect somebody else. But also, I've really been thinking about the idea about how there's a difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. And peacekeeping, even though you might feel like you're approaching that from a perspective of trying to make things better, it kind of is more of like a maintaining the status quo, whereas peacemaking is going to require more confrontation to get to a point where we can actually say all lives matter and it's not a BS statement.
On the confrontational point, I find it really useful to just ask why. Like, if somebody's saying something racist, like, why did you say that? Or why do you think it's okay to say that?
That's good.
And, like, sometimes, like, while they're trying to justify whatever, like, BS they're saying, they realize, like, what went wrong, right? And it makes them think, too.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resources out there now about how to have these conversations. Just one on the top of my head that I will just give a plug to here is Teaching Tolerance's book or little guide called Speak Up. It could be Speak Out, I'm sorry, but I think it's Speak Up. And you can download it for free. And I think it's terrific because it really does take this approach of how do you get people to see what's going on, what's embedded in their comments and conversations, their jokes, etc., how they are microaggressions, how they are hurtful. And they have it broken down by, in your workplace, in your family, with your friends. And there's some great kind of comebacks like that, something similar to what Xander says. One I always remember is, really, I always thought of you as, more open to hearing new perspectives. That's one example, but there's lots of great tools out there now. So again, it's about educating yourself. And I think engaging in these dialogues as a white person, that's my responsibility, right? And that's part of being accountable. And it's also a lifelong process, right? It's long. You're not going to just change people's views instantly, but hopefully over time you reach people and they hear some of the things you've said. So last question is, are there one or two resources, books, films you've seen, article you've read that you would recommend to people engaging with educating themselves right now, right? People who want to learn more.
Dear White People on Netflix.
Dear White People, which is on Netflix. And that's a TV show?
Yeah, it's a TV show, definitely written from the perspective of African American students in higher education. Maybe you guys can say more about it, but just letting white people know, like, hey, we don't own these institutions. Like, we like to think so, but that type of thinking needs to stop. I haven't seen it in a while. But another good one was When They See Us, about the Exonerated Five, or the Central Park Five. That was very informative. Yeah.
And is that a film?
It's also a series on Netflix as well. Yeah.
Great.
I have two. So
Yep.
one, it's called The Struggle for Black Equality. It's by Harvard Sitkoff. Highly recommend it. It's a historical review of Black people. I want to say since, it's been a while since I read it, but it's a review of Black history and our struggles to gain and create equity in the nation. And then I have another book. It's by
Sure.
Michelle Alexander. It's called The New Jim Crow, and it's about mass incarceration. So if you're new to the struggle, it's a good one, and that's a really good place to start if you're just now looking into systematic racism.
I don't
Yeah.
appreciate you stealing the book I was going to suggest.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
I
There
think one
must
great
be others,
Thing,
right?
a great
Other
thing
pieces.
about the new Jim Crow too is that it's very it's well researched. It has a lot of facts
Yeah.
and stuff. So if it's somebody who might respond with, well, that sounds anecdotal, it has so much good content and meat to it.
And I was thinking back about the comment I think Xander brought up that a friend or someone said, well, more white people get arrested, right? But that is true. But if you think about people's representation of their numbers in the population, that's not true, right? People of color are disproportionately imprisoned, right?
Also, most of
Arrested.
the time, the white people are doing something to get them in that position. A lot of the time, like, Black people are just driving.
Right. Excellent point.
Yeah, I was going to suggest the new Jim Crow. I'm just going to pretend I was the first one to suggest it. As far as reading, for those that I like to read a lot, so for those that are readers, and then for kind of the more visual people, I would say Blind Spotting recently by, I forgot how you pronounce his name, a boy from Hamilton. I think
Lynn.
no, I think it's David Diggs, one of the two, something like that. Blind Spotting is a good one. And for anyone that knows me is watching this, I will
Over there. Oh, no.
instantly plug J. Cole in any scenario, any of his albums speaking about personal issues in terms of addiction, speaking about the Black community in terms of how we can do better to each other as women, taxes, all sorts of different things. Any J. Cole's album, specifically KOD, the more recent one, I will plug that one easily.
Okay, great. And Blind Spotting is a movie. So you
Correct.
can probably find that on some sort of cable channel or rent it.
Last I saw, it was not on any of the streaming services that I know of.
Okay.
Unless you own Stars, which most people don't, so.
Well, that's something we can do, right?
Yeah.
Right to some of those cable companies, because that was an excellent film.
Mm-hmm.
Xander?
I really like Dirty River by, I know I'm gonna ruin the name, Leah Pipizana Lakshmi. It's a really good book about, it's a memoir about a queer person of color who's also disabled, and she talks about a lot of different things with that, and then like follow it up with people like Mia Mingus. I think like I like poetry, like listen to your Black poetry, like Audre Lorde, like go out there.
I would add Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. Well, that was the book. The book is excellent. I would maybe recommend that even more than the movie. But the movie is a great adaptation, and I believe it's still free on all services to rent for free right now for this month. So that's an excellent one as well.
And he's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and I encourage you to check out their website. And they're the organization that built it's not called the Lynching Memorial. I'm not sure, I don't remember what it's actually called, but that is part of what it's about, recognizing our history of lynching. So I encourage you to look them up. Any last comments anyone wants to make?
I
Shay?
have one.
Yeah,
We're in
thank you.
Colorado, so please remember Doremus Lemuel, remember Jeffrey Melvin Jr., remember Elijah McClain, and remember Devon Bailey, all victims of police violence and murdered in our state. That was it, though.
Thank you.
That's good.
No, thank you.
It's a strong way to end,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you to each one of you. And I'm sure everyone out there so appreciates you sharing, really in honesty, your experiences, putting yourself out there, making yourselves vulnerable, really. And I've learned so much from this conversation, and I'm sure others have as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you.